Okay, so let's unpack this. Imagine prehistory, not just being about stone tools and pottery, but like a moment where an entire society just fundamentally changed.
Right.
Everything.
How they ate, where they lived.
Exactly. Even the basic structure, who had what, that kind of fundamental shift.
It's the sort of transformation that really redefines a whole period. You're moving from one way of life to something pretty new.
Absolutely. And today we're diving into some incredible, really cutting-edge research that seems to have pinpointed just such a pivotal moment right in the core of Europe during the Bronze Age.
Yep.
It's talking around 1500 BCE.
Yeah, this deep dive takes us straight to the Carpathian Basin, and we're focusing on some, frankly, eye-opening findings from sites like the cemetery at Tiszafüred-Majoroshalom in Hungary. It's like a keyhole into this whole transition period.
And the way they figured this stuff out is just, well, it's fascinating. We've got a stack of research papers here, and they're using this bioarchaeological detective work. Techniques like looking at chemical signatures, isotopes, right, in ancient bones and teeth. That tells them about diet where people grew up. And get this, they even analyzed tiny bits of food trapped in hardened dental plaque, ancient plaque.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's really applying the power of modern science to unlock secrets held inside, ancient human remains.
So, our mission today.
Well, I think it's to pull out the most important nuggets from all this research and try to understand what these new scientific insights are actually telling us about the people, the individuals who lived through this really dramatic shift.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because these findings, they aren't just confirming what archaeologists maybe thought about this period and the big culture that emerged then, the Tumulus culture.
No, not at all.
They're actually forcing us to fundamentally rethink some pretty long-held ideas. It's quite disruptive, actually.
We're definitely seeing a much more complex picture emerge, and in some ways, yeah, a more surprising one, too.
All right, let's set the scene then. What was Central Europe like before this big change? Say, the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 2000 down to 1500 BCE.
Okay, so in the Carpathian Basin, the Middle Bronze Age, or MBA, was a time of pretty established societies. You had this patchwork of different cultures, like the Fudisaboni and Vatia cultures are mentioned in the sources, each with their own distinct characteristics.
And what defined their lives? What was the bedrock of their society?
Well, they had a solid economic base built on agriculture, farming, and also animal husbandry, keeping livestock.
Okay.
And there was significant craft production. And importantly, well-established long-distance exchange networks. So these weren't isolated communities at all. They were connected across the landscape.
Right. And those connections, trading goods, that led to visible social differences, presumably.
Precisely, yeah. The accumulation of prestige goods, fancy metalwork, things like that, it definitely seems to have contributed to increasing social hierarchies.
And you can see that archaeologically.
Oh, absolutely. You see it reflected very clearly in their burial practices. There are stratified graves suggesting, different levels of wealth or status within the community. And they also lived in these characteristic fortified tell settlements.
Tell settlements. Those are the big mounds, right? Built up over generations.
Yes, exactly. Often elevated, sometimes fortified. It suggests a really deep connection, maybe even a defensive one, to a specific place. And probably a more centralized way of living.
Okay.
So you get this picture of a relatively settled, complex society, probably with quite clear status differences.
Okay. Now, this period transitions into the late Bronze Age, around 1500 BCE. And archaeologically, that's marked by the appearance of this Tumulus culture.
Right.
As the name suggests, known for burying their dead under large mounds, these tumulus. Now, this whole transition, it's been a major debate for ages, hasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, decades, yeah. The big question was always, did the Tumulus culture represent completely new groups migrating into the area? Or was it more the local people just adopting new customs, new ways of life? Immigration versus local adaptation, basically.
And that's exactly where this new bioarchaeological toolkit comes in, offering potentially incredible new answers. So how did these techniques actually let researchers probe ancient diet and mobility in such detail?
Well, bioarchaeology really shines here because it merges that traditional archaeology with these really powerful scientific techniques applied directly to the human remains themselves. Think of it like molecular forensics, but for ancient populations.
Okay, explain the stable isotopes again. How do they work like a kind of ancient GPS and, nutritionist?
Okay, right. So imagine your tooth enamel like a time capsule from your childhood. The strontium isotope signature locked inside tells us about the geology, the underlying rock type of the area where you grew up.
Right.
Bone, on the other hand, it remodels throughout life. So it's more like a diary reflecting roughly the last 10 years or so of your life.
Ah. Yeah. So by comparing strontium in enamel and bone from the same person, you can see if they move significantly after childhood. Clever.
And diet.
For diet, they look mainly at carbon and nitrogen isotopes, usually in bone collagen. Nitrogen values, day on, tell you about protein intake, essentially, how high up the food chain you were eating. More meat means higher nitrogen values, generally.
Okay.
Carbon, day on C, tells you about the types of plants being eaten. Specifically, it helps distinguish between most common temperate plants like wheat and barley. Those are C3 plants, and certain other plants like millet, which is a C4 plant.
Got it. So strontium for where, carbon and nitrogen for what? And the dental calculus, what's the magic there? Sounds a bit grim.
Maybe a little, but it's microscopic gold for archaeologists. It's not just hardened plaque. It's like a fossilized menu trapped on the teeth.
Yeah. Tiny particles of food get mineralized right into it. So by analyzing these little bits under a microscope, researchers can identify specific things people ate, like starch granules from different cereals, plant fibers, or these tiny silica structures from plants called phytoliths. It's direct evidence right there in their mouths.
That is genuinely fascinating, finding actual meal remnants preserved like that. Okay, let's use these amazing tools then and deep dive into the radical changes they found in diet around 1500 BCE. First, the before picture, Middle Bronze Age diet.
Okay, so the nitrogen isotope studies, they confirm that people in the Middle Bronze Age, the MBA, had a pretty varied diet. But the key finding here is the significant variability within that MBA society.
Variability how?
In their dairy values, which means there were clear differences between individuals in how much animal protein they were accessing.
Right. And you mentioned earlier this might point to social inequality.
Yes, absolutely. The carbon and nitrogen isotope data strongly suggests that the social stratification we see in the archaeology, like in the burials, was also reflected in what people were eating day to day.
How so?
There was a noticeable tendency for males, on average, to have higher protein intake, higher day-in values than females. This strongly suggests unequal access to potentially higher status foods like meat or dairy.
Okay, so a diverse diet overall in the MBA, but definitely stratified along social lines, maybe gender lines too. Now, the big shift around 1500 BCE, moving into the late Bronze Age, the LBA, what happened to the food?
This is where we see a really dramatic change. The nitrogen isotope data shows a drastic reduction in the variability of those day-in values in the LBA. The whole range just shrinks considerably.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English? Less variability means?
It means a significant reduction in the average protein intake across the population overall. On average, people seem to be eating less protein. And crucially, the differences between individuals, particularly that male-female difference we saw so clearly in the MBA that decreased significantly too. The gap narrowed.
Wait a second. They ate less animal protein on average, and the dietary differences flattened out. That sounds like it completely refutes that long-held idea about the Tumulus Culture people being mainly pastoralists, heavily reliant on meat and dairy from herds.
It does, exactly. This is a bombshell finding, really. This isn't just some minor dietary tweak. The evidence from this study clearly refutes the idea that the Tumulus Culture, at least in this region, was primarily a pastoralist, meat-heavy economy.
So we have to completely revise our understanding.
Pretty much. Revise our understanding of their economic base, their daily subsistence, and, the flattening of those dietary differences. It aligns perfectly with the archaeological evidence showing a shift away from those rigid hierarchical settlement structures of the MBA tells.
Fascinating connection. Less hierarchy in settlements, less hierarchy in diet. So less protein overall, less dietary inequality. What about the plant side of things? Did that change too?
Oh, yes. This is where we see the introduction, or at least the major uptake, of a new staple crop that seems to have fundamentally changed their diet. The carbon isotopes, ANSIT, show a shift towards higher values in the LBA.
Higher carbon values mean?
It points towards the systematic consumption of C4 plants. And the key C4 plant identified here through multiple lines of evidence is broomcorn millet, Panicum miliacum.
Millet, huh. That's a grain we often associate more with, I don't know, later periods or maybe different regions.
Exactly. But this research has some really surprising details about the timing.
Mm.
The carbon isotope data, backed up by the dental calculus findings, strongly suggests that the consumption of millet began very early in this late Bronze Age transition. Specifically, they've dated individuals with this millet signature to between 1540 and 1480 BCE.
1540 to 1480 BCE.
Yeah.
That's incredibly precise for this kind of work. What's the significance of that early date?
Well, it makes this potentially the earliest known systematic consumption of millet in Europe. That's huge.
Wow.
Previous ideas generally placed widespread millet consumption much, much later, and the archaeobotanical evidence from the site itself, the actual plant remains in the soil layers, that supports this too. Millet wasn't really present in the earlier MBA layers, but then boom, it appears right alongside this isotopic shift in the human diet.
Okay, wow. Europe's earliest systematic millet use, potentially right here in the Carpathian Basin, around 1500 BCE. Why? Why would this grain suddenly become so crucial?
Well, millet has some useful characteristics. It's known for high resistance to drought, it's highly productive, gives a good yield, and it has a relatively short maturation period compared to things like wheat or barley.
So reliable and quick.
Potentially, yeah. Those characteristics could have made it a really valuable, reliable crop, especially if you're trying to increase food supply, maybe support populations in a landscape where society is reorganizing, settlements are shifting. And the dental calculus confirms its importance too. It shows up in a high percentage of the LBA individuals they analyzed who had consumed cereals. Much higher than in the late MBA population studied, where it was very rare.
They still ate other things, though. Wheat, barley.
Oh, yes, absolutely. The calculus showed other cereals like wheat and barley were definitely still present, but millet seems to have become a major new player in their diet.
Okay, so a major dietary revolution, it sounds like. Less protein overall, less inequality reflected in diet, and this potentially earliest systematic adoption of millet in Europe. Huge changes. Now let's shift gears a bit. What about mobility? Where were people coming from, or perhaps not coming from, as all this change was happening? Strontium isotopes give us the clues here, right?
Yes, exactly. Strontium acts as that geographic tracer we talked about earlier. So in the Middle Bronze Age at this site, Tiszafüred-Majoroshalom, the population was primarily local. Their strontium matched the local geology. But there were definitely noticeable immigrants mixed in.
Okay, and where were they coming from?
Their strontium signatures pointed towards origins in what we call more radiogenic geological areas, places with older rocks, basically. Generally, these areas were to the north and east of the site, places like the Upper Tisza Basin or the northern Carpathians.
Mm-hmm. Any patterns in who was moving?
There was a slight tendency for adult males to be more likely to have these non-local signatures in the MBA, slightly more mobile, perhaps.
Okay, and then in the late Bronze Age, as the Tumulus culture appears, what happens with mobility?
This is really interesting, too. The strontium isotope variability for the local individuals actually seems to slightly restrict in the LBA.
Strict, meaning?
It might suggest a bit less movement within the immediate local area, the hinterland, compared to the MBA. But perhaps more significantly, there seem to be fewer identified immigrants overall compared to the MBA population they studied.
Fewer immigrants. Yeah. But did their origins change?
Yes, and this is key. The origins of the few LBA immigrants they did identify seem to shift.
Shift how? You said the MBA immigrants came from more radiogenic areas to the north and east?
Exactly. The LBA immigrants' strontium signatures point towards less radiogenic areas, places like the Middle Danube region, maybe the Southern Carpathians or the Trans-Danubian hills over to the west.
Ah, to the west.
Yeah.
Now, how does that shift in origin connect to the Tumulus culture and that big debate about migration versus local change?
This is where it really starts to tie together nicely. These new origins for the LBA immigrants from the West and South, they align geographically with the known archaeological distribution of the Tumulus culture and the proposed direction of its expansion, which was generally seen as coming from the west towards the Great Hungarian Plain where our site is.
Okay.
And crucially, the early dates for some of these LBA individuals who have these non-local Western-type strontium signatures dating around 1500 to 1400 BCE, this supports the idea that there was some migration happening from the West, precisely at the onset of the Tumulus culture's appearance in this specific region.
Right. So the data suggests it wasn't like a total population replacement. Not everyone was new.
No, definitely not.
But there was an influx of people, potentially from areas already associated with the Tumulus culture, arriving right when all these other changes started kicking off.
That's the interpretation best supported by this multi-isotope data. The majority of the population studied still appears to be local to the region based on their strontium, which means the dramatic cultural shifts we see archaeologically, the new burial rites, pottery, settlement patterns, were likely a really complex process.
A mix?
Probably a mix, yeah. Local people fundamentally adapting their lifestyle and culture, but influenced by and possibly integrating with these new arrivals, bringing elements of the Tumulus culture package from those Western areas.
Okay, let's try and bring all these fascinating threads together. Then you've got the straightforward archaeological evidence, people abandoning those long-used fortified MBA-tel settlements around 1500 BCE.
Right when the Tumulus culture emerges.
Exactly. And the Tumulus culture has different settlement patterns, less centralized, maybe more horizontal networks, perhaps shorter occupation periods for individual sites.
Yeah. And this new scientific data shows just how deep the connection was between that visible change in how and where people lived and the really fundamental aspects of their daily lives that move away from the fixed, maybe more rigid, hierarchical tell settlements. It aligns perfectly with the isotope evidence for a looser, less structured social system.
Which we literally see reflected in that reduction in dietary inequality in the late Bronze Age data.
Precisely. It's remarkable.
So the change in material culture, the different pottery styles, the new burial customs like the tumuli, it wasn't just skin deep. This study shows these changes were intrinsically linked to the basics. How people fed themselves, their core economy, their diet.
Even presumably how they cooked their food, right down to the introduction of a completely new staple grain like millet.
Yeah. What's really fascinating here is how all these different lines of evidence, from digging up settlement mounds and graves to analyzing isotopes in bones, right down to finding microscopic food particles stuck in teeth, they all converge. They create this coherent picture of a truly profound, system-wide societal reorganization happening around 1500 BCE.
It really was a transformation.
Okay, so this deep dive has really uncovered a remarkable transformation in Bronze Age Central Europe. We saw this, this dietary revolution marked by the systematic adoption of millet, potentially the earliest widespread use of it in Europe we know of.
And that surprising decrease in average protein intake, and importantly, the decrease in social dietary inequality, which completely challenges those older ideas about Tumulus culture pastoralism.
Definitely. We also saw how mobility patterns shifted. Fewer immigrants overall identified in the LBA sample, but crucially, those who did arrive seem to have come from areas to the west.
Right, aligning geographically and chronologically with the spread of the Tumulus culture, supporting the idea of some migration playing a role in bringing this new cultural package into the region.
And maybe most importantly, we saw how these deeply personal changes, what people ate every day, where they or their neighbors moved from, were fundamentally tied to the big picture, the abandonment of their old fortified homes, and a total reorganization of their society, seemingly away from rigid hierarchy.
It truly highlights how combining that traditional archaeological fieldwork with these incredibly powerful modern bioarchaeological techniques, it's essential now.
Yeah.
It lets us move beyond just studying the artifacts and the settlement layouts, important as they are, to really try and understand the intimate details of past lives, how individuals actually experience these large-scale cultural shifts.
It gives us a much richer, much more human picture of prehistory, doesn't it?
Indeed it does. It shows that these major cultural transformations, they aren't just abstract events you read about recorded in layers of soil. They're felt right down to the very food people eat and the places they choose to call home.
So, a final thought then, for you listening. If radical shifts in something as seemingly simple as diet and mobility were so fundamentally linked to the breakdown of old social hierarchies and settlement patterns thousands of years ago, back in the Bronze Age, well, what might that tell you about how interconnected the seemingly simple parts of your own life, what you eat, where you live, how you move might be, with the biggest societal changes happening all around you, even today? Something to ponder.